Big Shaq, driving to a community event to surprise children with gifts, is spotted by a racist cop who requests him to pull over. As he steps out of the car, the cop lights his ID on fire, unknowingly setting himself up for a lesson he won't forget. Subscribe, and like this video to see how the story unfolds. On this sun-kissed, vibrant day, the retired NBA superstar Shaquille O'Neal sits behind the wheel of his shiny black SUV. As he glides down the bustling suburban street, his tall, imposing figure stands out against the colorful backdrop of the lively neighborhood. His lips curve into a peaceful smile as he hums along to a tune that lifts his spirits. Life, as it often does for Shaq, is in harmony with his plans to surprise local children with a generous gift at a nearby community event. With a sudden jolt of shock, the mellow mood in Shaq's SUV is disturbed by the abrupt appearance of flashing blue and red lights in the rearview mirror. Instinctively, the former basketball star pulls his vehicle over to the side of the road, his mind racing with perplexity. On patrol, Officer Drake, notorious for his ingrained bigotry and brutal misuse of authority, advances towards Shaq's SUV. His harsh expression alone sends a shiver down the onlooker's spine, indicating trouble brewing on this seemingly peaceful day. Responding to the encroaching police officer, Shaq reaches out and rolls down his window, adopting a mixture of bewilderment and vigilance in his demeanor. Approaching the SUV with a self-satisfied grin, Officer Drake exits his patrol car, adjusting his sunglasses in a brazen display of confidence. His steps possess a cocky swagger as he strides towards Shaq, exuding an aura of entitlement and malice. Officer Drake, his features twisted into a grimace of disdain, barks his demand for documentation in a tone befitting a drill sergeant. Drake, license and registration. The request reverberates through the air with a biting chill, instilling a sense of dread in the unsuspecting Shaquille O'Neal. As the police officer's words settle, Shaq begins to rummage through his glove compartment, searching for the required items. Shaq, handling the situation with an unruffled composure, extends his hands to offer the license and registration to Officer Drake. Despite the air of apprehension, his voice remains steady and composed. Shaq, good morning, officer. Can you tell me what this is all about? His query, clear and polite, seems to do little to quell the chill emanating from the officer, whose eyes fix themselves on the paperwork, scrutinizing them with unwavering focus. Officer Drake's eyes flick dismissively over the documents, a contemptuous snort escaping his lips. His condescending gaze shifts to Shaq, his words laced with thinly veiled derision. Drake, driving a fancy car in a neighborhood like this? You tell me. His tone exudes a brazen disregard for the former athlete, suggesting that Shaq's mere presence in the neighborhood is justification enough for this stop. The tension continues to escalate, the air crackling with unspoken malice. Shaq, displaying an unwavering professionalism, arches a single inquisitive eyebrow in response to the officer's flippant behavior. His tone remains calm and measured, a stark contrast to the palpable hostility exuding from Officer Drake. Shaq, is that an official charge? The question is simple yet loaded. A verbal chess move designed to test the officer's dubious motivations. The two men's gazes lock, a silent battle of wills that crackles with tension. Officer Drake, his eyes narrowing into slits of menace, shifts his weight forward, his body language radiating an almost predatory hostility. He leans towards Shaq, his head nearly pressing against the rolled-down window of the SUV, violating the former athlete's personal space. Drake, growling, step out of the car. The command, dripping with authority, conveys no room for negotiation or compliance. The verbal jousting has come to an end, and the looming prospect of violence begins to permeate the air. Despite the palpable sense of danger in the air, Shaq remains unshaken. He sits in the driver's seat, his gaze meeting the officer's with unwavering defiance. Shaq, can you at least explain why? The request, bordering on defiance yet rooted in logical deduction, adds another layer of tension to the encounter. Shaq's refusal to comply without explanation appears to infuriate the officer, his lips curling into a vicious snarl. Officer Drake, his patience at its breaking point, enunciates each word with deliberate venom, punctuating them with the unspoken threat of force. His mouth twists into a tight, venomous rictus, his words imbued with a barely contained rage. Drake, seething, step out of the car. The command echoes with the finality of an executioner's blade, the air thick with the promise of violence. Shaq, his gaze unflinching, remains unmoved, his refusal to comply indicative of a deep-rooted defiance. Complying at last, Shaq exits the SUV, the shadow of his towering physique enveloping the comparatively diminutive officer like a living monolith. His exit is smooth and deliberate, his stature emanating an aura of unbridled power. Across the street, the commotion begins to attract the attention of several passers-by, their eyes now trained on the unfolding scene. The rhythmic bustle of the once vibrant neighborhood seems to pause, a palpable silence falling as the encounter reaches its critical mass. Officer Drake, unflinching in his determination, gestures towards the squad car with a stiff, authoritative hand. His voice, now raised in volume to match the gravity of the situation, commands Shaq's attention. Drake, barking, "Over there, hands where I can see them!" His words, thick with aggression, leave no room for discussion. Shaq's eyes, fixed on the officer's weapon, slowly raise his hands into the air, a silent display of cooperation that hides the inferno of defiance simmering just beneath the surface. With the calm, deliberate movements of a man used to calculated restraint, Shaq places his palms against the cool metal of the police cruiser, his posture one of apparent surrender. Yet, in the depths of his gaze, a spark of defiance continues to smolder, a quiet ember fueled by his unbreakable dignity. Shaq, still waiting for an explanation, the words uttered with an undercurrent of quiet rage belie his outwardly passive demeanor. Officer Drake, incensed by Shaq's refusal to bow, narrows his eyes into vicious slits. Ignoring Shaq's request, Officer Drake commences his apparent inspection of the SUV, rifling through the vehicle with a methodical determination that belies his true intentions. Every crevice, every nook, every cranny is scrutinized, as though he is searching for a non-existent piece of evidence. Then something catches his eye, Shaq's ID, a beacon of identity sitting innocuously on the dashboard. Officer Drake's hand darts out, snatching the card like a predator pouncing on its prey. Officer Drake's lips curl into a smirk, the sight of Shaq's name triggering a scornful response. He thrusts the card back at Shaq, his tone laced with undisguised contempt. Drake, sneering, "Shaquille O'Neal? What, you think being some big-shot athlete means you're above the law? Do you know who you're dealing with?" The venom in his voice seems to intensify, a sinister undercurrent that raises the tension to near unbearable levels. Shaq's shoulders sag with a heavy, resigned sigh, his attempt to de-escalate the encounter reflecting his innate sense of wisdom and restraint. His features, once a stoic mask of quiet defiance, now soften into a semblance of understanding. Shaq, sighing, "Look, officer, I'm just trying to keep things calm. I'm not here to start any trouble." His voice is measured and level, a deliberate attempt to humanize himself in the eyes of a man determined to paint him as a villain. In a calculated, almost leisurely motion, Officer Drake produces a cigarette lighter from his pocket. As he flips open the lid, a devious smirk of triumph paints his lips, a visible display of confidence in the power he holds over Shaq. Drake, smirking, "Well, I don't care who you are, I don't care what your name is. You're just another punk to me, and I've dealt with punks like you before." The threat in his voice is unmistakable, a low rumble that hints at the looming danger still to come. With deliberate malice, Officer Drake raises the lighter, its flame dancing in the afternoon sun. He applies it to the edge of Shaq's identification card, setting the plastic alight. The card's remnants, now wreathed in flickering orange flames, fall from his grasp to the asphalt below. Without hesitation, the officer grinds his heel into the charred remains, leaving nothing but a smoldering smudge on the concrete. Shaq, his eyes wide with disbelief, watches the desecration of his identification with mounting horror. Officer Drake, his expression devoid of remorse, speaks in a voice dripping with mock sympathy. Drake, sneering, "Oops, guess you're not going anywhere now. No ID, no nothing. That's what happens to people who disrespect me." He towers over the remnants of Shaq's identification, his stance radiating a menacing arrogance that borders on sadism. Drake, "You should have listened when I told you to show me some respect, but now you've made your bed. And now, well, now you..." Shaq's eyes, now narrowed to slits, blaze with barely contained fury, yet his composure remains intact, his demeanor a thin veneer masking the tempest brewing within. Shaq, that's not just an ID you burned. That's your career going up in flames. You might think you're tough, but you've just made the biggest mistake of your life. His voice is a controlled growl, each word weighted with a quiet promise of retribution. A cruel chuckle spills from Officer Drake's lips, its sound curdling in the still air. His expression is rife with triumphant malice, a smug satisfaction etched across his features. Drake, chuckling, "You threatening me?" His question, laced with arrogance and contempt, speaks volumes about his skewed perception of the situation. To him, the power dynamics are clear. Shaq is nothing but a criminal to be subjugated. Drake, "Because if you are, I've got a jail cell with your name on it." Shaq shakes his head, a mirthless smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His gaze, laser-focused on Drake, conveys the gravity of his words, their weight sinking into the police officer's consciousness. Shaq, "Not at all, just saying you'll regret this." His tone is flat, yet the portent of his words hangs heavy in the air. For a split second, a flicker of uncertainty crosses Drake's features, a fleeting hint that perhaps he has underestimated the situation. With a fluid movement, Shaq retrieves his phone from his pocket, his fingers dancing across the screen with a practiced precision. In the tense silence that ensues, his phone chimes with each number he taps, the sounds punctuating the heavy atmosphere like the ticking of a time bomb. As he presses the final digit, Shaq presses the device to his ear, the tension coiling tighter with every second. Officer Drake, his brow furrowing with suspicion, steps forward. His voice, now tinged with a note of concern, crackles like a whip across the stillness. Drake, barking, "Put that down! Who are you calling?" His gaze darts back and forth between Shaq's phone and his face, his stance tense and wary. The realization that he might have bitten off more than he can chew seems to dawn on him, even as Shaq presses the phone closer to his ear, listening intently. Shaq's gaze remains unflinching, his poise unshaken by the fuming officer before him. Into the phone, his voice remains calm and collected, a masterful juxtaposition to the escalating tension. Shaq, calmly, "Hey Chief, it's Shaq. I need you to send some units to my location." He pauses, listening to the response on the other end of the line. Officer Drake, his anger now bordering on panic, steps closer, his hand inching towards his holster. Officer Drake, his bravado wavering, stares at Shaq with newfound wariness. His voice, once commanding and assured, betrays the first cracks in his armor. Drake, stammering, "The Chief? You expect me to believe that you know the Chief?" His question hangs in the air, a pitiful attempt at regaining the upper hand. Shaq, his phone still pressed to his ear, offers him a knowing smile, the corners of his lips curling upward in a taunting, self-assured smirk. Shaq's smile widens, his expression radiating a sense of smug satisfaction that's almost palpable. His words, dripping with confident nonchalance, are delivered with the precise control of a masterful conductor. Shaq, smirking, "Stick around, you'll see." His gaze never wavers, his attention now divided between the police officer before him and the ongoing conversation with the chief. Officer Drake, his features contorted with a growing sense of unease, clenches his teeth as he processes the mounting implications of Shaq's words. As though summoned by Shaq's phone call, a fleet of police cars screeches to a halt, their lights painting the asphalt in a strobe of red and blue. The squad car doors swing open, and a man in uniform, the chief himself, emerges, his expression as hard as granite. The chief, his gaze taking in the scene before him with a calculating sharpness, strides towards Shaq and Officer Drake with deliberate, measured steps. The chief, his voice gruff yet familiar, locks eyes with Shaq, his question carrying a subtle hint of concern. Chief, gritting, "Shaq, you all right?" Shaq, his shoulders relaxing slightly, nods in affirmation, his expression one of measured relief. The juxtaposition between his demeanor and the escalating tension around him is a testament to his unwavering poise. Officer Drake, stunned by the turn of events, gapes in disbelief. His expression morphs into one of shock and incredulity, his jaw hanging slack as he reels from the revelation. Drake, stammering, "Wait, what? The chief knows you?" His words, once brimming with arrogant disdain, are now laced with a raw mixture of confusion and panic. The chief, meanwhile, offers Shaq a nod, his acknowledgement reinforcing his support. Shaq, nodding his head in the direction of the scorched ID lying at Officer Drake's feet, levels a glare of hardened accusation at the rogue cop. Shaq, his voice cool and controlled. Your guy here decided to burn my ID for fun. The phrase, your guy, hits home. The phrase a sharp reminder of Officer Drake's precarious position. The chief, his eyes narrowing in disapproval, shifts his gaze towards the officer, his stare radiating an icy judgment that speaks volumes without uttering a word. The chief, his expression now cast in shadows of disapproval, confronts Officer Drake, his gaze demanding an answer. Chief, his voice a low growl. Drake, is this true? Drake, aware of the precarious situation unfolding before him, stumbles over his words, his face flushed with a combination of shame and panic. Drake, stammering, Sir, I was just doing my job. The chief, his jaw clenched, shakes his head in disgust, his silence speaking volumes. Shaq, sensing the imminent wrath of the chief, takes a step forward, his presence both calming and commanding as he intervenes. Shaq, his voice a firm but measured command, Hold up, Chief, I've got this. The chief, taken aback by Shaq's self-assured demeanor, pauses, a hint of intrigue flickering in his gaze. Drake, his apprehension now palpable, watches the interaction with bated breath, fully aware that the tables have irrevocably turned. As Shaq's words echo through the air, the throng of onlookers parts, their attention riveted on the imposing scene before them. Shaq, his strides purposeful and measured, closes the distance between him and Drake, their proximity now a confrontation in and of itself. Shaq, his voice now a low rumble. You think you're tough? Let's see how you handle someone your own size. The towering athlete's presence, coupled with his imposing words, sends a wave of anticipation rippling through the crowd. A fear-stricken Drake attempts to retreat, his instinctual flight response kicking in, but Shaq, determined to impart a lesson that will linger long after the day's events, stands his ground, a formidable wall of muscle and bone. Shaq, his tone a quiet threat. Oh, no you don't. You burned my ID. Now, you're going to pay the price. Drake, his back pressed against the hood of his squad car, recognizes the futility of resistance. As the crowd's anticipation builds, a mischievous grin curls the edges of Shaq's lips. He extends an unexpected challenge to Drake, his suggestion delivered with a playful air of arrogance. Shaq, his voice mockingly lighthearted. Hey, officer, how about a little push-up contest? You against me. Sound good? Drake, caught off guard by the unconventional request, hesitates, his gaze flickering between Shaq's beaming smile and the increasingly expectant crowd. His pride, wounded by the recent turn of events, spurs him on. As Drake finishes the competition, utterly defeated, Shaq's demeanor takes on a more serious note. Taking a step closer, the former basketball star leans in, his words resonating with a newfound sense of gravity. Shaq, his voice a stern lecture. This isn't about you winning or losing. This is about respect, dignity, and accountability. You disrespected me, Officer Drake, but more importantly, you disrespected this community. This isn't what a badge means, and it's certainly not what it stands for. The chief, his voice firm but contrite, steps forward, his expression a mixture of contrition and admiration. His eyes meet Shaq's with a newfound respect, his gaze communicating a shared sense of justice and duty. Chief, offering a sincere apology. Mr. O'Neill, on behalf of the entire department, I'd like to apologize for Officer Drake's behavior. His conduct today is unacceptable, and he will be facing the consequences. Shaq, his gaze unwavering, nods in acknowledgement of the chief's apology. His words are measured, but carry a weight that commands attention. Shaq, with a stern, resolute tone, Good, make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. This kind of behavior is inexcusable, and I won't stand for it. The chief, aware of the gravity of Shaq's words, nods solemnly in agreement, his eyes lingering on the disgraced officer for a moment before returning to Shaq. The crowd erupts into thunderous applause, their cheers ringing in the air like a victory anthem. Shaq, radiating a sense of righteousness and pride, climbs into his SUV, his demeanor radiating a quiet triumph. As he drives off, the sunlight glinting off the shiny black metal of his vehicle, the crowd watches on with a newfound sense of respect, admiration, and hope for a brighter future. In the wake of Shaq's departure, Officer Drake, his face reddened with shame, slinks away, a haunting reminder of the importance of integrity justice, and humility.